Good evening, everyone.
Danielov, how are you?
Oh, Hashem, thank you.
Darav, we were, I think, in the middle of Bet in Bet Yosef. We were talking about dessert drinks, and the dessert is is separate from the meal.
Yeah, I see that. Okay. Yeah, okay. So yeah, we'll continue over there. So it says here, כתבו התוספות, says תוספות, פרק כיצד מברכים. It's פרק over there in ברכות, מ"ג עמוד א', גבי הואיל ואין בית הבליעה פנוי, צריך עיון קצת מהבדלה. So it says here that שאנו מבדילים ועומדים איך אנו פותרים זה את זה מיין והבדלה אחרי שאין אנו יושבים ולא מסובין ושמא יש לומר So he's talking here about Havdalah. How do we absolve one another if we're not really sitting down to have for something like permanent? Okay, so let me just explain to you what he's trying to say here. That he's saying that, there's a rule like this in halakha that when you get together to drink, with a group of people, so what happens is that if it's something which is kavua, which means that it's like, permanent, fixed, something set. So in a case like that, one person makes a blessing for everybody. But if it's not something like that, it's not kavua, so then everybody blesses for himself. So the question he's asking over here is that since it's not really kavua when it comes to Havdalah, all you're doing is just sitting there, to make Havdalah basically, right? It's not something kavua. It's not something permanent that you're going to sit there for a while. So he says, then how can we make one blessing for everybody? Seems to contradict that concept that I just told you. That's his question over here. Okay, so let's see what he answers. He says, בשם יש לומר, מתוך שקובעים עצמן כדי לצאת ידי הבדלה, so he says, but you know what, they are actually, right, they are actually setting here something, it's like a set kind of thing. What does that mean? They're set to do Havdalah, which is also something set, right? Something, like organized. So he says, therefore, it's considered to be like that they're doing something fixed and set. So therefore, that's why one person can make the blessing for everybody. Look what he says, right? So he says, therefore, he says it's proper that they should sit for Havdalah. Shiraz Yanireh Kekeba, because that seems like more permanent, right? As we said, Upoter otam, and therefore he absolves them. Lechen kateva Mordechai Sham. That's what it says in the Mordechai. This is very interesting, this concept here. But there's a couple of things here to learn, which is that number one, this is a source for. This is not the only source, but it's one source that Havdalah should be really done sitting, and that's what the Sfaradim do. We do Havdalah sitting. The Ashkenazim, they do Havdalah standing. They have a different custom, There are different customs, regarding this. But according to this, right, it's clear that you're supposed to be sitting. So now he moves on into the next piece of the tour, which says that the person who blesses on the wine, which is after the meal, right, also will bless on the mugmar, right, which is the incense. In those days, this was a thing. They used to do like incense at the meal, to make it smell nice, like a nice air freshener there. So regarding this, right, says Bet Yosef, he brings a source for this. Mishnah Perek Kitzad Mivrachim, right? So Mishnah there in Brachot also, Mem Bet Amud Bet. Ve'hu Omer ala Mugmara. So he says, right, he also says the blessing on the incense. So what does that mean? Since the incense had a good smell, they would bless on it, right? The blessing for fragrances. Rashi explains there the that it's referring to that blessing that he makes on the wine after the meal. So you know how it is, right? After you do Birkat Hamazon, you bless on a cup of wine. This is only done, by the way, if you have three males there. If not, the custom is not to do this. This blessing. But when you do have three men, for a meal together, so then there is a mitzvah to have a cup of wine to bless on afterwards. It's considered to be a big deal, by the way. In the Talmud, in the Zohar, also in Kabbalah. It's like brings blessing, blah blah blah, all kinds of stuff. It's a big thing in Judaism. This whole thing. So that's why people who are very meticulous about mitzvot. That's what they do. They have a cup of wine afterwards. They drink, and they're holding that cup. By the way, for Birkat Hamazon, as I say Birkat Hamazon, they're holding the cup. It's all ritual there. So, okay. So yeah, and also if a person is married, the custom was to send that cup, to his wife to drink, and that was supposed to give her like blessing, for giving birth, having children and so forth and so on, being fertile. It was a fertility blessing, whatever. Okay, so yeah, let's move on. So משנה פרק כיצד מברכים, והוא אומר על המוגמר פירש רש"י דקאי אותו ברך שמונה עיניים, וכן דעת הרמב"ם. Rambam also says, Rabbeinu Yonah, also Rabbeinu Yonah, פירש בשם הגאונים, he explains the name of the game, Rabbeinu Yonah, גאונים, דקאי אותו שברך המוציא, so he says, no, it's talking about the person who did המוציא. ומיירה כשהביאו באמצע הסעודה, and it's talking about when they bring this wine in the middle of the meal, right? During the meal. So he explains it differently, Rabbeinu Yonah. Okay. Anyway, let's move on. ומברכים משתעלה תמורתו. So then, right, says the Tur, when do we bless on the incense? Right? Once the smoke, goes up, right? Starts to, go up and into towards the ceiling, whatever. So then they bless on it, for the fragrance. So regarding that, says Bet Yosef, Sham Mem Gimel, right? What's the source for this? And Brachot Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Meimatai Mevarech Ala Mugmar, Mishatalid Timurato, right? So what does that mean? As we said, right? Once a column of smoke goes up from the incense, that's when we bless on it because that's when you smell it, whatever. That's when you really get the whiff of the smell. Okay. So this was a thing, in their days, they used to have incense during the meal. Nowadays, nobody does this, obviously, except the hippies. The hippies do this now. Okay, whatever. So, I don't think there's any hippies left either. They're all gone already. They're all dead. Okay. So anyway, right, let's move on. מה שכתב חוץ ממושק. So yeah, let's go back to the tour, and look at the language there. We have to see some things there. We're missing some tour text. Okay. Well, you know what I'll do? I'll just like start from the beginning of this chapter, then tour, and read it, because I think we're missing some things here. It's good to read the tour also, get the whole text. There's a lot of good stuff in there. So it says over here like this, right? Yain shebetoch haseudah mevarchin alav borei pri hagefen, right? As we said, that when you have wine in the meal, during the meal, you say borei pri hagefen, right? The Ashkenazim, they say hagafen, right? Right? I don't have to tell you that. I hope you know. Okay. Gofen, hagafen. We say hagefen. ואם אין לו אלא כוס אחד. So it says, if there's only one cup, מניחו עד לאחר מזון. Look what it says, right? If he only has one cup of wine, right? Let's say, right, he didn't go to, the liquor store was closed, so he didn't get much wine this week. You know what I mean? So he's like down to the, down to the last drop. So he only has one cup left, So he says, right, what you should do is don't drink this during the meal, but rather save it for the end of the meal, right? And drink it over there because that's the real mitzvah, as we said, right? There's a special mitzvah to do it at the end of the meal. So that's what he says, okay. ואין המילה צריך לברך בתוך הסעודה שלא קבע שזאת לפני המזון, אבל לקבל לשתות לפני המזון, אין צריך לברך בתוך המזון. Look, so this was, what you asked last week, right? Which was that, when you make kiddush, do you still need to make borei pri hagefen during the meal? So here he tells you, right, something similar to that, which is that if you, had like a little, cocktail, thing there before the meal, right? You know, some pre-meal drinks. Some people like to do this, right? Have some cocktails and then, get into the meal. In restaurants, like, in the cool restaurants, it's like a thing, You come in, you have some drinks first, then they bring you the meal, right? So you're already drunk, when you're eating. It's okay, whatever. So anyway, right? Uh, what he says is that if you had like this kind of thing, cocktails before, you don't have to bless again during the meal because basically you're still sitting there in one place. So you already blessed before, so now there's no reason to bless again. So same thing also applies to kiddush, right? If you made kiddush, you don't have to bless during the meal. What for? Right? It's redundant. There's no need for that. So same idea. שלא קבע לשתות עוד לפני מזון, אבל קבע לשתות לפני מזון, לא צריך לברך פתח זמנו. דהיינו לפני מזון פותר טוב, וכן היין של קידוש, right? Exactly, it says, right? The same thing applies to the wine of kiddush. פותר יין שבתוך המזון. It does absolve, right, the wine which comes during the meal. That's exactly what we said, right? וכן המבדיל על השולחן פותר על היין שבתוך המזון. So it says the same thing also applies to Havdalah, right? So what does that mean? If you're making Havdalah, right? And then you're doing Malava Malka right afterwards. So also there, you don't need to bless on the wine because you already did in the Havdalah. But as we mentioned last week, right, that if you are, waiting for a while, right, doing some kind of a pause, and then you're doing some other activities and stuff, so then you would have to bless again, because that's already, interruption. How long, by the way, does it take to make an interruption, in terms of the timing, right? So the general rule is,
Time it takes to greet your rabbi, right?
I'm sorry?
Is it the time it takes to greet your rabbi?
No, I'm not talking about that. That's something else. That's a different issue, right? I'm talking about, in other words, if you had a cocktail, right, or you had a kiddush before the meal, how long does it take, right? How long, in other words, how soon do you have to have the meal to not have to bless again? Maybe you didn't understand my question, right? So the answer is, yeah, you were saying something. Anyway, so the answer, usually, right, for these kinds of things, we say it's a half hour. So if you're having the meal within a half hour after the kiddush, you don't need to bless again. But if you're waiting more than a half hour, it's already considered an interruption. So then you would have to bless again during the meal. So that's what I do. I usually like make kiddush in the morning because I go now to early minyan, and as I said, and then what I do is I go and study for a while, then I come back and eat later.
But you,
So yeah,
you study for less than a half hour, or you have to bless again?
no, it's like 2 hours. It's like
You have to bless again.
yeah, of course, there's no question about it, right?
I thought you were talking about before you bless, before you
Yeah, you misunderstood me.
before the
Hey,
mitzvah.
whatever, it's all good, right? Now we understand each other, right? So that's what we were talking about last week, same thing. So half hour is the rule, there, right, regarding these kinds of things. Because within a half hour, it's considered to be like immediate. And after that, it's not immediate anymore. Okay. All right, it's good. So let's move on. So then we're saying, so now he says even something further, right? That also, if you had, like, as we said, those cocktails before the meal, um, so that will not only absolve the drinks during the meal, but also after the meal as well. He says that, right? מי שרגיל לקבוע שתות יין אחר גמר סעודתו לפני ברכת המזון. Oh, okay, right. So, but that's before ברכת המזון, it says, right? In other words, it's like you finish the meal, you're done, like, pretty much with your main course and everything. And then you're just like sitting around, whatever. And you have this decide to drink more, aperitif kind of thing, right? After, dessert drinking, whatever. So that stuff, is also absolved, by what you did before the meal, what you drank before the meal. Right? If you're drinking that much now, right, by now you're like totally sloshed, you drank too much already. Before the meal, during the meal, after the meal. You're gonna need to sleep for a while. Okay. That's a different story. Okay. So in those days, people drank, they were drinkers, they know how to hold their liquor. Okay. So then he goes on to say, יין שלפני המזון פטרתו, אבל אמר רב, לא שנה דיין דיין שלפני המזון פטרתו, אלא שבשבתות ויום טוב, שאדם קובע עצמו על היין, שלקח כשבירך. So says Rav, right, this only applies for Shabbat and Yom Tov, this rule. Because it's like very fixed, the whole meal is fixed. ילקח כשבירך לפני המזון, therefore when he blesses before the meal, היה דעתו גם על שלח המזון. That was also, he was also intending to drink after the meal as well. His aperitif, whatever they call that. אבל כל ימות השנה בירך על היין שלפני המזון. But he says when it comes to weekdays, if you drink, right, wine, cocktails before the meal, you didn't really absolve what you're going to do after the meal. That's already too, it's not really connected anymore. But at least during the meal, he admits, right, that it is absolved, just after the meal is, in other words, for dessert. The dessert meal. The dessert after the meal. כתב רעב"ד דווקא במקום שאין היין מצוי. So he says, Ravad says that this is only in a place where there's no wine, there's not abundance of wine there. אבל במקומות שעלו שאין יין מצוי, but he says in our place, where there's, plenty of wine, right? אין חילוק בין שבת ביום טוב. Then he says there's no difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov. As I said, right, in those days they drank, these people, they drank. They really had, lots of drinks. Like for whatever soft drinks are to us, that wine was for them. That's pretty much what it was. Okay, whatever. Anyway, so So he says if that's the case, if there's plenty of wine, says the Rava, then there's no difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov or weekdays. It's all the same. Okay. So then he says, but he said that only applies to wine that you drink before Birkat Hamazon, right? That's it. Once you finish your meal, right? Your dessert meal, your dessert drink, whatever. But he says once you did Birkat Hamazon, that's a different story, right? That's already it's a new ball game. Right? You need to make a new blessing there. Right? Doesn't matter whether it's weekday or Shabbat and Yom Tov, right? Which reminds me, of the the Haggadah of Pesach, right? That over there, the Haggadah of Pesach, we do another blessing after Birkat Hamazon, right? We bless again, Borei Pri Gifen. Why is that? Because once you finish your meal, you got to bless again. Once you said Birkat Hamazon, you got to bless again. That's why we do that. And don't tell me, you were already absolved, during the meal. It's not the same thing, right? Once you do Birkat Hamazon, it's like a clean slate. You gotta, it's a restart button, you gotta reset. Okay. Let's move on. So he says, "V'chol ma sheshoteh betoch haseuda." So he says, whatever he drinks right during the meal, dai lo b'birkat bracha achad. It's one blessing is enough. How many blessings do you have to make during one meal? בהנה מילה בסתם, אז that's about regular, אבל כשברך לא היה דעתו לשתות רק אותו הכוס, but he says, but if when he, made the blessing, he was only, intending to drink that cup and no more, ונמלח, and then he changed his mind, לשתות right אחר, אפילו בתוך הסעודה צריך לברך. They don't have to bless again, even during the same meal. ודווקא לפני היין צריך לברך בתוך הסעודה. So it says, when we say you have to bless for wine, right, during the meal, that's only before, right? but afterwards, you don't have to bless, right? שנפטר ברכת המזון. Why? Because ברכת המזון will absolve you from the after blessing. So no reason for that, right? כל שאר המשקים שבסעודה אינו צריך לברך. So he says, right, but when it comes to other drinks during the meal, we don't bless, as we said, right? We don't bless on beer and liquor and stuff like that. Techashibe kebayin mechamat hasel, because they're considered to be like, subsidiary to the meal, more or less. Lefi she'en derech le'echol belo shtia. Why? Because people usually drink during the meal something, right? They don't like just go dry during the meal. So the truth is, right, that even the wine really shouldn't require a blessing. But he says, because it's prominent, as we said, right? Wine is the most prominent drink in Judaism. That's the way it is, right? So therefore, it requires a bracha, a blessing by itself. Therefore, you need to bless beforehand. Okay, that's the tour. So yeah, let me just see if we're caught up here with the Bet Yosef. I read through half the chapter already. So let's see what's going on. Yeah, so the truth is we have to read more, because I see that we didn't get up to this place yet. So I'll go back there and read more. So then he says the Torah. Ubahag katav, right? It says the Bahag. Sheyesh levarech al hamayim shebeseuda. So he holds that you're supposed to bless on the water during the meal, right? This is a machloket. But then the Rosh katav. Yesh omrim sheyesh levarech al hamayim shebetach haseuda. So the Rosh says, right? There's an opinion that says you have to bless. I'll call palm with the water. I'll call palm every time you have. So he says it's considered to be like everything is new, every cup is new. Why? Because he doesn't really drink more than one cup usually, only if he's thirsty. But lo mistaber li klal. So he says, I don't accept this. Interesting. Who's saying that? The tour, right? The tour is, I'm sorry, not the tour. The Rosh is saying that. He doesn't agree with this opinion. Because he says that, why? Because it's not really possible to, eat without drinking something, you got to wash it down a little bit. And he's not really, right, making an interruption when it comes to drinking, he intends to drink more. All the while that he's eating the meal. So he says, if you want to, right, get out of the doubt over here, right, of this, machloket that we have here. So he says, what should you do? Before you start the meal, right, make a blessing on some water, shakol, and this way, whatever you do during the meal will be absolved. But this is like a chumrah, I remember there was one kid, in Israel, I saw him, he used to do this. I mean, like nobody else did it besides him, He was a little bit ridiculous, doing this thing kind of thing. Okay, whatever, it's not ridiculous really, I mean, but since nobody does it, it's really, looks weird. Okay, God bless, but it's all good, it's all good. ואם המסובין רבים אפילו הסיבו ביחד כל אחד ואחד מברך לעצמו. So he says, right, so now we're getting to this issue that we started, right, which is that if they're sitting down to, together for, food or drink, whatever it is, so it's as if they all, reclined, sat down and reclined together. Each one blesses for himself, alayin, for the wine. Shebatoch hamazon, which is during the meal. Hoil ben bet b'liya panui. So he says, why is that? Because he says the person is too busy, drinking and stuff, eating, whatever. So in other words, his throat is full of food. ויש רש"י ואין לב המסובין אלא המברך אלא לבלוע ובעיני דעת שומע. Right, so he says because of that, people are too busy, swallowing their food. And they're not really, right, concentrating on this, they don't have intention to fulfill their obligation from your blessing because they're too busy eating. Right, so we require that it should be both, right? The one who's eating and the one who's blessing needs to have intention for this, for this to work. So he's telling you, right, that they're too distracted by eating, so they don't really have right, the concentration, the intention to fulfill their obligation with this blessing. Okay, let's move on. So he says the Rosh writes, "Mitam zeh yesh omrim she'im amar varech sabri ma'anan." Because of this reasoning that we just said, right? If the one who's blessing says sabri ma'anan, והם מפנים בית הבליעה כדי לשמוע שפיר דמה. So then, right, it's fine. You know why? Because this way they know now to pay attention to the blessing, right? To have it in mind. The ones who are eating there. That's why, we have this custom in the Sfarim. Before we make a blessing on the wine, we say Savri Maranan. What does it mean, Savri Maranan?
With your permission.
So this is like an Aramaic, thing. So what does that mean? Savri means pay attention, right? Like dear friends, pay attention. That's what it really means. Okay, so we're telling them like heads up, wake up, listen to my blessing. Okay, good. So what does it mean, Maranan, right? My masters, right? In those days, people were very respective. Not like today, right? They don't give you lots of respect today. But in those days, people were very respectful. They treated each other with lots of respect. Yeah. So it's like in Hebrew we say Rabotai, right? Which means my masters, right? So Maranan is the same thing as Rabotai in Aramaic. Okay, good. So ומיהו לא נראה היי תמה, so it says, but it doesn't seem right. שאף על פי שאוכלים יכולים לשמוע על הברכה, even though it says that the people who are dining can hear the blessing, צאת בשמיען and fulfill obligation. By hearing it, נראה שהתם כמו שמפרש. Yerushalmi. So it seems like the real reason is like what it says in Yerushalmi. She'eni yocholim la'anot amen. They cannot really answer amen. This is the problem, right? Why can't they answer amen? Because they're too busy chewing their food. I mean, so he says that's really the reason why we don't do this. So therefore, what do we do, right? In order to alleviate this problem, each one blesses for himself, you know. So this way, it's not a group thing. Every person, you know, every individual who, you know, stop chewing and stop swallowing, then, you know, he knows how to bless for himself. This way, there won't be any issues. But if one has to do for everybody, you know, that means everybody has to stop, and you're not gonna, you know, achieve that. You know, it's gonna be hard to achieve this. Okay, very good. Let's move on. So he says, "She'en masichim b'seuda shemi yakdim kaneh le'veshet," right? So he says that's the thing, you know, that we have this rule that you know, you're not supposed to talk during the meal. Why is that? Because you know, it's a choke hazard. You know, you may go down your windpipe, right, to the food. Choke hazard, you know, and that's why the rabbi said, you know, don't talk during the meal, right? So you know, we already mentioned this before, right? We do talk during the meal, but you know, what we do is, hopefully, this is what you do. if you if you have a you know if you have a decent mind, right? Your mind works pretty good. What you do is, you know, you don't talk when you're chewing, right? You know, and this way, you know, when you swallowed, then you can talk, you know, in between, right? In between gulps or in between, right? Whatever, right? You're eating, whatever, right? That's what you do. So then you can talk during the meal. This is also an American thing, right? The Americans say, you know, like don't talk when you chew, right? It's proper manners also. In the good old days, you know, when America was normal. Okay, okay. When people had some manners in America, you know, that was different. The good old days. Okay. So anyway, let's move on. ואפילו אם שומע כעונה ויוצא בלא עניית אמן, so it says, even if he's going to tell me that he doesn't really have to say amen for, you know, to fill the obligation, חיישינן שמא יענה amen ילקח, we're concerned that he will, you know? And this way it's a choking hazard, as we said. ילקח ככל עניין, כל אחד מברך לעצמו. So therefore, this is why we say, you know, in this kind of scenario, the proper thing to do is each one blesses for himself. This way, you know, there won't be any right mishaps like this. והיין שלאחר המזון, אם הסיבו, אחד מברך לכולם. Right? So it says, regarding, right, the wine which comes after the meal, if they sat down, right, you know, it's a fixed group, as we said, right, fixed. אחד מברך לכולם. So then one blesses for everybody. So what are we talking about? We're talking about just like drinking, you know? So then there's no choking hazard there involved. You know, they're all like together as a group, you know, having you know, some cocktails together, whatever, right? So there, one blesses for everybody. We just mentioned this in the beginning of the lecture. So it says, "Dinan afilu belo heseba v'sefer mitzvot." So it says for us, this is even without reclining. You know, why is that? Because you know we don't really recline anymore, right? That was the good old days. You know, people used to recline when they sat down to eat or to drink. You know, this was a thing like that. The reclining mode, right? The good old days, whatever. Okay. ובספר המצוות כתוב So it says in the Sefer Mitzvot, "She'en anu regilim likvua ela bepat." So he says we don't really, do this. What does that mean? We don't get together, as a group just to drink. Like this custom doesn't exist anymore. You So he says we only do this, for meals. Like, we don't really do it for drinking. So there he says, right? When it comes to wine and other things, he says, right there, one cannot really fill the obligation of the other. Why? Because we don't do this anymore, right? It's not fixed, it's not set to sit down all together, have some kind of a get together like that. So he says, what's the difference between their times and our times? But he says the difference is that really there's no difference between bread and wine. The one does not fill the obligation of the other. Unless they're sitting together as a group, It's a fixed kind of meal kind of thing. So he says for us, just by sitting down together, then right, one will fill the obligation of the other. B'yeshiva, when it's sitting in the chud. So he says, what about if they brought some other drinks, besides wine? So what happens over there? Right, after the meal, right? Ima yain with the wine. There's also other drinks, right? Whatever, right? Liquor, all kinds of stuff. God knows. And tzrichim levarech alein. They don't have to. They don't have to bless on it. Why? The yain poter kol minei mashkes. We already said, right? The wine absolves all the other drinks. So once you blessed on wine, there is no reason to bless on any other drink. Whether it's soda or water or beer, whatever it may be, right? It's all absolved by way of the wine. Okay. So it says the one who blesses on the wine, which is after the meal. He also will bless on. Right, this is where we are, right in the Beit Yosef. We finally caught up. We had to read the whole chapter. Can you imagine? Wow. Okay. I thought it was only a part of it. We're done with the whole thing. So it says the one who, right, as we said, blesses on the wine after the meal, he also blesses on the incense, right? This is where we were. Perush, right? So it says, what is this, right? We're talking about, this, right? Incense, which is made out of all kinds of, herbs, right? Spices, God knows, whatever it is, right? Shayu regilim leavi achar seuda. They used to bring this after the meal. Ul ashnan, right? And they would like burn the incense, on coals. So once the smoke would go up, they would bless on it. Bore isbeva samim, right? This is the blessing they would make. Bore isbeva samim. What does the word isbe mean? So isbe means grass, right? Because these are like herbs, so we call them grass. Not that grass, the people who smoke today, right? We're not talking about that stuff. That's a different story. Okay. So anyway, right, ve'im hu aseh v'samim, right, and if it's right, it's coming from it's coming from trees, right? Herbs, that come from trees, and all kinds of fragrances, right? Like in Israel, by the way, like where I used to live, they had like these lavender trees, and when you would pass by the tree, if there was, especially if there was a little bit wind, it was like, oh my God, you were in Gan Eden, it was like such a beautiful smell. You felt like you were in paradise. I never had that experience here in America, to have a tree like that around me. But in Israel, this is like common stuff. Yeah, it's nice. So anyway, so then, right, if it comes from a tree, as we said, right, then the blessing is different. Bore atzeh b'samim, right? Atzeh means right trees, you know. So if it's herbs, you say isbe. If it's tree, you say atzeh. That's what we do also today, you know, when we do Havdalah, right? Depending on what the source is for the herbs, right? We, bless accordingly, right? If it comes from a tree, we say atzeh. If it comes from the grass, the ground, whatever, then we say isbeh. Okay, good. What else we got here? But he says there's also a third category, right? I hope you know this, right? There's also things which don't come from a tree or from the ground. So he says, what's an example of that, right? Musk. They had musk in the old days too, which is like animal derived. There's different animals, by the way, they derive musk from. I'm not going to get into now this whole analysis over here, right? Which animals and stuff, whatever, right? We'll leave that for a different time. But anyway, right? It's animal source, right? It's animal based. So therefore, right? What do we bless on that? Bore mine v'sami. Right? So mine means like types of herbs, whatever, right? But we don't say right because they don't come from the ground, so we don't use the other terminology. Doesn't apply to it. So when you bless on herbs, you have to know what you're blessing on, right? In order to make the proper blessing, If you're not sure, right? If it comes from a tree or whatever, you're not sure. So then you should say mineh, right? Because mineh covers everything, like types of herbs, covers everything. But if you do know which one it is, you should say the right one. Like, many of us, like, in the Sephardi community, we do Havdalah, we bless on cloves. That's our thing, nowadays. So the custom by us, we bless on cloves atzeh, because it comes really from a tree, So that's our custom, but the Ashkenazim they say mineh, they're not so sure about the cloves, So they're a little bit in doubt, but we're sure about that. Okay, that it's a tree, So we say atzeh. Okay, whatever, it's all good. Anyway, so that's the story there. So let's see. Kind of late. So let me just see how much Shulchan Aruch we got here. I finished the whole chapter already. So I guess what we'll do, we'll continue next time, and we'll do, Bet Yosef Shulchan Aruch, and we'll wind down this right, chapter, right? Hopefully tomorrow or some other time, sometime in the future. Okay, thanks for coming. Be blessed and well with wealth and health and happiness. Laila Tov, Chazak Baruch. We'll see you tomorrow. We're getting such good news from Israel. Good things going on. God bless. It's beautiful. We'll see you tomorrow, Bezat Hashem. Chazak.
Kavod Harav, thank you so much.
Yes.